March 17, 1946, Portland, Oregon. When the city council voted unanimously to ban Japanese nationals from owning businesses within city limits, nobody imagined that within 5 years, a former enemy soldier would stand beside an American florist at the altar of St. Michael's Cathedral, or that their union would transform the most prejudiced neighborhood in the Pacific Northwest into a symbol of reconciliation that would be studied by sociologists for generations.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
Mayor Robert Thornton stood at the podium of City Hall, his voice resonating with the certainty of a man who believed he spoke for every citizen. The resolution before him was clear, supported by overwhelming public sentiment and backed by federal precedent. Japanese nationals, he read from the prepared statement, represent a continued threat to American security and economic stability. Their presence in our community undermines the sacrifices made by our soldiers who fought and died in the Pacific Theater. This council hereby prohibits the transfer, sale, or operation of any business license to persons of Japanese national origin within the incorporated boundaries of Portland, Oregon. The vote was unanimous. 23 council members raised their hands in agreement. The gallery erupted in applause. Veterans groups had lobbied for this measure for months. Business owners along Burnside Street had collected over 3,000 signatures supporting the ban. The Portland Gazette editorial board had endorsed it without reservation. Mayor Thornton believed he was protecting his city from a threat that every reasonable person recognized. What the mayor did not know, what none of the council members could comprehend, was that at that precise moment, 3 miles away, in the basement chapel of Sacred Heart Hospital, a young woman named Eleanor Hartwell was teaching basic English to 17 Japanese prisoners of war who had volunteered to remain in America rather than face repatriation to a devastated homeland. Among those prisoners sat Kenji Nakamura, a former Imperial Army corporal who had been captured at Saipan, who spoke no English beyond basic commands, and who had just asked Eleanor, through gestures and broken phrases, if she could teach him the English word for the white flowers she always wore in her hair. The word was gardenia. Within 4 years, Kenji would own the most successful flower shop in Northeast Portland, and Eleanor would be his wife. The confidence of Portland city leadership in March 1946 was not mere prejudice. It was based on what appeared to be historical inevitability and moral certainty. The Pacific War had ended only 7 months earlier. American casualties in that theater exceeded 100,000 dead. Portland had lost 417 sons in battles against Japanese forces. Every family knew someone who had died at Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, or Okinawa. The stories returning servicemen told about Japanese soldiers painted a picture of an enemy fundamentally different from European adversaries. Japanese forces had committed documented atrocities. They had executed prisoners, conducted death marches, and demonstrated a willingness to fight to the death that seemed incomprehensible to Western military tradition. The cultural gulf appeared unbridgeable. Beyond military antagonism stood economic resentment that predated the war by decades. Japanese immigrants had established successful businesses in fishing, agriculture, and retail before 1941. Their economic success had generated resentment among white business owners who viewed Japanese commercial practices as unfairly competitive. The internment of Japanese Americans during the war had been popular in Portland. Citizens had supported the relocation with minimal protest. Property confiscated from Japanese families had been redistributed to white owners. The economic reorganization was seen as correcting an imbalance that had disadvantaged native-born Americans. Reverend Thomas Ashford of First Presbyterian Church, the largest congregation in Portland, had preached a sermon in February 1946 that articulated the prevailing moral framework. The Japanese people, he declared from his pulpit, have demonstrated through their conduct in war that they lacked the Christian values necessary for integration into American society. Their emperor worship, their death cult mentality, their treatment of prisoners, all reveal a fundamental incompatibility with Western civilization. To allow Japanese nationals into our community would be to invite corruption of our values and endangerment of our children. The sermon was reprinted in the Portland Gazette and distributed as a pamphlet throughout the city. Over 15,000 copies circulated. No prominent voice in Portland contradicted its message. The federal government's position seemed to support Portland's stance. The War Relocation Authority was actively preparing for the repatriation of thousands of Japanese nationals who had been held in internment camps throughout the war. Priority was being given to removing enemy aliens from American territory. Immigration from Japan remained completely prohibited. The legal framework appeared to make Japanese integration impossible even if social attitudes had been welcoming. Dr. Howard Mitchell, chairman of the sociology department at Portland State College, published a research paper in March 1946 arguing that Japanese cultural values were fundamentally incompatible with American democratic principles. His study cited Japanese language structure, family hierarchy systems, and religious practices as evidence of cognitive differences that made assimilation impossible. The paper was cited in city council meetings as scientific justification for exclusionary policies. Veterans organizations provided the most vocal opposition to any Japanese presence in Portland. The Veterans of Foreign Wars post on Sandy Boulevard had collected testimonies from returned servicemen describing Japanese military conduct. These accounts, compiled in a document titled "Why We Cannot Forget," circulated throughout the city and was presented to the city council as evidence that Japanese people could never be trusted as neighbors or business partners. The American Legion had gone further, organizing patrols in neighborhoods where Japanese families had lived before internment, ensuring that no Japanese person attempted to return to confiscated property. These patrols were conducted openly with police cooperation and were covered favorably in local newspapers as examples of veterans protecting their communities. What none of these authorities understood, what their certainty prevented them from seeing, was that human connection operates according to principles that transcend cultural programming and historical grievance. While Mayor Thornton was signing the business ban into law, Eleanor Hartwell was learning that Kenji Nakamura had been a gardener in Osaka before the war, that he had been conscripted against his will, that he had surrendered at Saipan because he could not reconcile his orders to fight to the death with his belief that life was sacred, and that he dreamed of growing flowers again if he could ever find a place that would allow him to plant roots. Eleanor owned a small flower shop on Alberta Street that she had inherited from her father. She had begun volunteering at Sacred Heart Hospital because her brother had died at Okinawa, and she believed that teaching English to former enemies was the only way to honor his death with something other than hatred. She didn't tell anyone about her volunteer work. Her friends wouldn't have understood. Her mother had begged her to stop. But Eleanor had discovered something that contradicted every certainty her community held. The men she taught weren't monsters. They were farmers, teachers, fishermen, and gardeners who had been swept up in a war they never chose and who now faced repatriation to a devastated homeland where starvation was killing thousands. The mathematics of hatred that seemed so certain to Portland's leadership were about to be challenged by an equation they never considered: that shared humanity could prove stronger than inherited enmity, and that a flower shop on Alberta Street would become the proving ground for a transformation nobody believed possible.
The certainty that Japanese people could never integrate into American society was not born from ignorance. It was constructed from decades of carefully documented evidence, scientific research, and lived experience that created what appeared to be an unassailable logical framework. Portland's position in 1946 reflected a national consensus built on historical precedent, cultural analysis, and economic data that made Japanese exclusion seem not merely justified, but mathematically inevitable. The foundation of this certainty stretched back to 1882, when the Chinese Exclusion Act established the legal principle that Asian immigrants were fundamentally incompatible with American society. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. That legislation had been renewed and expanded multiple times, each iteration reinforced by social science research purporting to demonstrate Asian cultural inferiority. By 1924, the Immigration Act had extended these principles to Japanese nationals, creating a legal framework that prevented Japanese immigration entirely. This was not the work of ignorant bigots, but of Congress members who had commissioned studies, heard expert testimony, and concluded that Asian exclusion served the national interest. Dr. Madison Grant's influential 1916 work, The Passing of the Great Race, had provided intellectual justification for Asian exclusion that was taught in universities across America. His theories about racial hierarchy and cultural compatibility were considered mainstream science, not fringe ideology. Portland State College Sociology Department had required Grant's work as reading material until 1944. Professor Mitchell's 1946 paper arguing against Japanese integration was built on this established academic foundation. The economic arguments against Japanese business ownership appeared equally solid. Before the war, Japanese immigrants had established dominance in specific economic sectors through what white business owners characterized as unfair practices. Japanese farmers in Oregon's Willamette Valley had increased agricultural productivity through intensive cultivation methods that white farmers considered unsustainable exploitation of soil. Japanese fishermen had adopted techniques that dramatically increased catch rates, undermining established fishing operations. These economic successes were interpreted not as superior business practices, but as evidence of cultural willingness to undercut American standards. The Portland Business Association had compiled detailed statistics in 1941 documenting Japanese commercial expansion. Their report showed that Japanese-owned businesses had increased market share by 18% between 1935 and 1940 in retail sectors along Burnside and Alberta streets. White business owners had watched their customer base erode as Japanese shops offered lower prices and longer hours. The internment had reversed this trend. White-owned businesses had reclaimed market share, and business leaders were determined to prevent Japanese commercial resurgence. Thomas Brennan, who owned Brennan's Hardware on Alberta Street, had been particularly vocal about Japanese business practices. He testified before the city council in February 1946, presenting financial records showing how Japanese-owned shops had underpriced his store before the war. They were willing to accept profit margins that no American business could sustain, he explained, his voice carrying the frustration of a man who had nearly lost his family business. They lived 10 people to a house, worked 18-hour days, and reinvested every penny into expansion. How can American families compete with that? His testimony resonated because it reflected experiences shared by dozens of Portland business owners. The cultural arguments carried even greater weight because they were framed in terms of values rather than economics. American churches had long characterized Japanese prayer practices as incompatible with Christian civilization. The concept of emperor worship seemed particularly alien and dangerous. How could people who had been taught to view their emperor as a living god ever embrace democratic principles that placed sovereignty in the people? Reverend Ashford's sermons articulated concerns that most Portland residents shared instinctively. The Japanese soldiers' willingness to die rather than surrender, documented in countless Pacific battles, was interpreted as evidence of a death cult mentality, fundamentally at odds with Western valuation of individual life. American soldiers fought to survive and return home. Japanese soldiers fought to die gloriously. This difference seemed to reveal cognitive frameworks so divergent that coexistence appeared impossible. The kamikaze attacks had particularly reinforced this perception. Portland had lost 7 sailors to kamikaze strikes in the final year of the war. The idea that pilots would deliberately crash their aircraft into ships, viewing suicide as honorable service, seemed to confirm that Japanese culture operated according to principles incomprehensible to Western minds. How could people who glorified suicide as the highest form of loyalty ever understand American concepts of individual rights and personal autonomy? The treatment of prisoners provided what seemed like definitive proof of Japanese cruelty and moral inferiority. Stories from the Bataan Death March had circulated widely in Portland. Veterans who had survived Japanese prisoner of war camps returned with accounts of systematic brutality, starvation, and torture. These were not propaganda fabrications, but documented facts. The Geneva Conventions had been violated systematically. American prisoners had been worked to death, denied medical care, and executed for minor infractions. Captain William Harrison, who had survived 3 years in a Japanese POW camp in the Philippines, spoke at Portland's civic organizations throughout early 1946. His testimony was devastating. "They treated us as less than human," he told audiences at the Rotary Club and Chamber of Commerce. "We were given bowls of rice with maggots and told to be grateful. Men who were too sick to work were beaten until they could stand. I watched my friends die of diseases that could have been treated with basic medicine that the Japanese had but refused to provide. When we were liberated, I weighed 93 pounds. I went into that camp at 175. Captain Harrison's physical presence reinforced his words. Even months after liberation, he remained gaunt, his uniform hanging loosely on a frame that had not fully recovered. When he showed photographs of himself before capture, the transformation was shocking. This evidence seemed irrefutable. How could a culture that treated prisoners with such systematic cruelty ever be trusted as neighbors? The linguistic argument added another layer to the case against integration. Japanese language structure was fundamentally different from European languages. It lacked direct equivalents for concepts like individual rights, personal freedom, and equality before law. Dr. Mitchell's research had documented these linguistic gaps, arguing that they reflected cognitive limitations that made democratic participation impossible for native Japanese speakers. The language encoded hierarchical relationships into every sentence. Different verb forms were required depending on the social status of the speaker relative to the listener. This linguistic hierarchy was interpreted as evidence of cultural programming that made egalitarian principles incomprehensible to Japanese minds. How could someone whose language forced them to constantly acknowledge social hierarchy ever embrace the American principle that all men are created equal? The writing system provided additional evidence. Japanese used 3 different scripts, 2 phonetic systems, and 1 based on Chinese characters that required memorization of thousands of individual symbols. This complexity was interpreted as creating cognitive barriers that prevented Japanese people from fully engaging with Western texts and ideas. The difficulty of translation between Japanese and English was cited as evidence of fundamental conceptual incompatibility. Portland's Japanese American community had been approximately 1,200 people before the war. They had lived primarily in neighborhoods along Alberta and Burnside streets, operating small businesses and maintaining distinct cultural practices. Their children attended public schools, but also attended Japanese language schools on weekends. They celebrated Japanese festivals and maintained connections to Japanese cultural traditions. This maintenance of separate cultural identity was interpreted by white Portland residents as evidence of unwillingness to assimilate. If Japanese immigrants truly wanted to become Americans, critics argued, why did they maintain Japanese language schools? Why did they celebrate Japanese holidays? Why did their children speak Japanese at home? This preservation of cultural heritage was seen not as natural immigrant behavior, but as evidence of fundamental loyalty to Japan rather than America. The internment had been supported by 87% of Portland residents in 1942, according to a Gazette poll. That support had not wavered significantly by 1946. Most Portland residents believed the internment had been a necessary security measure that had prevented sabotage and espionage. The fact that no Japanese American had been convicted of sabotage was interpreted not as evidence of loyalty, but as proof that internment had successfully prevented planned attacks.
What made Portland's certainty particularly resilient was that it was maintained not by extremists, but by the city's most respected institutions and leaders. The mayor, city council, business association, churches, veterans organizations, and academic institutions all agreed. This consensus created a framework where dissent seemed not merely wrong, but incomprehensible. Eleanor Hartwell understood this consensus intimately because her brother Michael had died at Okinawa in April.
The transformation began not with grand gestures or dramatic pronouncements, but with the simple act of learning to pronounce a flower's name. Eleanor Hartwell had expected her first teaching session with Japanese prisoners to confirm everything she believed about her brother's killers. Instead, she encountered 17 men who sat quietly on wooden benches in a basement chapel, their faces reflecting not defiance or cruelty, but exhaustion and uncertainty about a future that offered them nothing but return to a homeland that no longer existed in any recognizable form. The Sacred Heart Hospital program had been established quietly by Father Michael O'Brien without publicity or official approval. 17 Japanese prisoners of war had volunteered to remain in America rather than face immediate repatriation. They were not criminals or fanatics, but men who had been captured early in the war, who had spent years in detention camps, and who now faced the choice between returning to a Japan devastated by firebombing and atomic weapons, or attempting to build new lives in a country that despised them. The legal framework for their presence was ambiguous. They were technically enemy aliens awaiting deportation, but the chaos of post-war administration meant that thousands of such cases remained in bureaucratic limbo. Father O'Brien had negotiated an informal arrangement with military authorities, offering to house these men in hospital facilities in exchange for their labor in hospital maintenance and groundskeeping. Eleanor's initial teaching plan had been simple, almost contemptuous in its basic assumptions. She would teach essential English phrases that would help these men understand orders and navigate basic transactions before their inevitable deportation. She expected sullen resistance or hostile silence. What she encountered instead was desperate eagerness to learn, as if English language acquisition represented the only lifeline to a future that otherwise offered nothing but starvation in a destroyed homeland. Kenji Nakamura had been seated in the back row, a slender man in his early 30s wearing the plain work clothes provided by the hospital. He did not speak during that first session, but Eleanor noticed that he watched her mouth carefully when she pronounced words, silently forming the shapes himself, trying to match her pronunciation. When the session ended and the other men filed out, Kenji approached her hesitantly. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small folded piece of paper. Inside was a pressed white flower, its petals brown with age but still recognizable. He pointed to the flower, then to the small white blossoms Eleanor wore pinned in her hair, a habit she had maintained since her father's death. He spoke in Japanese, a question evident in his tone, though Eleanor understood nothing of the words. She pointed to her hair flower and said slowly, "Gardenia." Kenji repeated the word, his pronunciation awkward but earnest. "Gardenia." He smiled slightly, the first smile Eleanor had seen on any Japanese face since beginning her volunteer work, and carefully refolded the paper containing his pressed flower. That moment, that simple exchange about a flower's name, began to crack the foundation of Eleanor's certainty about the impossibility of connection across the gulf of war and cultural difference. The revolution that would transform Alberta Street began in conversations Eleanor had not planned and discoveries that contradicted everything her community had taught her. In their second session, Kenji brought a small notebook filled with careful pencil drawings of flowers, each labeled in Japanese characters. Through gestures and the few English words he was learning, he communicated that he had been a gardener in Osaka, that he had specialized in growing chrysanthemums and peonies for temple offerings, and that he had been conscripted into the army in 1942 despite being the sole support for his widowed mother. Eleanor learned that Kenji had been captured at Saipan not through combat defeat, but through deliberate surrender. He had walked toward American lines with his hands raised, an act that Japanese military doctrine considered the ultimate dishonor.
He had made this choice because he could not reconcile orders to fight to the death with his Buddhist belief in the sanctity of all life. His surrender had saved his life, but had also severed him completely from the only world he had known. Return to Japan would mean facing a society that viewed surrender as unforgivable shame. Remaining in America offered the possibility of continuing to exist, even if that existence meant permanent exile from everything familiar. Through weeks of lessons that gradually expanded beyond basic vocabulary into actual conversations conducted in broken English, supplemented by gestures and drawings, Eleanor discovered that Kenji's story was not unique among the men she taught. Nearly all had been conscripts rather than volunteers. Most had been farmers, fishermen, or tradesmen before the war. Several had surrendered rather than following orders to fight to the death. They were not the fanatics that American propaganda had portrayed, but ordinary men who had been swept into a war machine they had not chosen and could not escape. The philosophical framework that would challenge Portland's certainty emerged from an unexpected source. Father O'Brien had been holding weekly discussion sessions with the Japanese prisoners, exploring questions of faith, morality, and reconciliation. He invited Eleanor to attend one of these sessions in April 1946, suggesting that she might find it relevant to her teaching work. What Eleanor witnessed challenged every assumption she had maintained about Japanese cultural values and moral capacity. Father O'Brien had posed a question to the group through a translator who volunteered at the hospital. If you could return to the moment before you were conscripted, knowing everything you now know about the war and its outcome, would you refuse military service, even if refusal meant imprisonment or death? The discussion that followed revealed moral reasoning that Eleanor had been taught Japanese culture could not produce. Kenji spoke longest, his words translated carefully by the volunteer interpreter. He explained that Buddhist teaching emphasized compassion for all living beings, that taking life violated fundamental principles he had been taught since childhood, but that refusing conscription would have meant his mother would lose government support and likely starve. He had chosen service over refusal not from loyalty to emperor or nation, but from obligation to keep his mother alive. The war had forced him to choose between two forms of harm, and he had chosen the path that protected the person who depended on him, even though that choice required him to carry a rifle and participate in a war he believed was wrong. This moral complexity, this articulation of competing obligations and tragic choices, contradicted the narrative that Japanese soldiers were mindless fanatics who glorified death. Kenji had made rational calculations about harm and duty under impossible circumstances. His decision to surrender at Saipan represented another calculated choice, recognizing that continued fighting served no purpose except adding to the count of the dead. Eleanor's flower shop on Alberta Street had been struggling since her father's death in 1944. She had maintained it more from sentiment than business acumen, lacking her father's knowledge of horticulture and his relationships with wholesale suppliers. The shop survived but did not thrive. In May 1946, Eleanor mentioned to Kenji during a teaching session that she was having difficulty with her rose bushes, which had developed some kind of blight that was killing the blooms before they fully opened. Kenji asked if he might see the plants. The following Saturday, with Father O'Brien's permission, Kenji accompanied Eleanor to her shop. What happened that afternoon would establish the pattern that would eventually transform both the shop and the neighborhood, though neither Eleanor nor Kenji understood the full implications of what they were beginning. Kenji examined Eleanor's rose bushes with the careful attention of someone who understood plants at a level Eleanor had never achieved. He identified the problem immediately, a fungal infection caused by poor drainage and excessive moisture retention. Through his limited English and extensive gesturing, he explained that the soil needed amendment, that the watering schedule needed adjustment, and that infected canes needed to be pruned and destroyed to prevent spread. He worked for 3 hours that afternoon, his movements efficient and knowledgeable, transforming the diseased rosebed into something that might actually produce healthy blooms. When Eleanor offered to pay him, he refused, explaining through halting English that being able to work with growing things again was payment enough, that he had not touched soil or living plants in 4 years, and that the opportunity to garden, even briefly, was a gift he could not accept money for. That moment,
That simple exchange about a flower's name began to crack the foundation of Eleanor's certainty about the impossibility of connection across the gulf of war and cultural difference. The revolution that would transform Alberta Street began in conversations Eleanor had not planned and discoveries that contradicted everything her community had taught her. In their second session, Kenji brought a small notebook filled with careful pencil drawings of flowers, each labeled in Japanese characters. Through gestures and the few English words he was learning, he communicated that he had been a gardener in Osaka, that he had specialized in growing chrysanthemums and peonies for temple offerings, and that he had been conscripted into the army in 1942 despite being the sole support for his widowed mother. Eleanor learned that Kenji had been captured at Saipan not through combat defeat, but through deliberate surrender. He had walked toward American lines with his hands raised, an act that Japanese military doctrine considered the ultimate dishonor. He had made this choice because he could not reconcile orders to fight to the death with his Buddhist belief in the sanctity of all life. His surrender had saved his life, but had also severed him completely from the only world he had known. Return to Japan would mean facing a society that viewed surrender as unforgivable shame. Remaining in America offered the possibility of continuing to exist, even if that existence meant permanent exile from everything familiar. Through weeks of lessons that gradually expanded beyond basic vocabulary into actual conversations conducted in broken English,
The crisis that would force everything into the open arrived on October 3, 1946, in the form of Margaret Sullivan, president of the Alberta Street Business Association and owner of Sullivan's Bakery 3 doors down from Eleanor's flower shop. Mrs. Sullivan had been observing the flower shop's transformation with growing suspicion that had finally crystallized into certainty about what she was witnessing. She arrived at Eleanor's shop at 9 in the morning, her expression carrying the righteous anger of someone who believed they had discovered a betrayal that required immediate confrontation. Eleanor was arranging chrysanthemums in the front window when Mrs. Sullivan entered, the small bell above the door announcing her presence with a cheerfulness that contrasted sharply with the woman's demeanor. Mrs. Sullivan did not waste time on pleasantries. She pointed directly at the chrysanthemums and spoke with the controlled fury of accusation. "Those are Japanese flowers," she stated, not as a question, but as an indictment. "I have been watching your shop for months, Eleanor. I have seen that Japanese man coming here every Saturday. I know what you were doing, and it ends today. Either you stop employing that enemy alien immediately, or I will report you to the city council, the police, and every newspaper in Portland. You have violated the business ownership ban, you have violated federal employment laws, and you have betrayed every person in this neighborhood who lost family members fighting the Japanese." Eleanor's response would establish the pattern that would eventually transform Alberta Street, though in that moment she was simply trying to prevent the immediate destruction of everything she and Kenji had built. Eleanor did not deny Mrs. Sullivan's accusations, because denial was impossible. Instead, she invited Mrs. Sullivan to sit down, offered her tea, and began to tell the story that she had kept hidden for 6 months. She explained about her volunteer teaching, about discovering that the Japanese prisoners were not monsters, but men who had been conscripted against their will, about Kenji's background as a gardener in Osaka, about his Buddhist beliefs that had made him surrender rather than fight to the death, and about how his knowledge had saved her failing flower shop. Mrs. Sullivan listened with an expression that shifted from anger to confusion to something Eleanor could not initially identify. When Eleanor finished, Mrs. Sullivan sat silently for nearly a minute before speaking. Her voice had lost its accusatory edge, but retained deep uncertainty. "My son died at Tarawa," she said quietly. "He was 19 years old. The Japanese soldiers on that island fought until almost none were left alive. They killed nearly 1,000 American boys. You are asking me to believe that the man who tends your garden is fundamentally different from the men who killed my son?" Eleanor had no answer that could bridge that gulf of grief and loss. She could only offer truth. "I don't know if Kenji is different from the soldiers at Tarawa," she admitted. "I only know that he is a man who grows flowers,
who surrendered because he believed killing was wrong, and who has shown me nothing but gentleness and dedication to creating beautiful things. I cannot speak to who he might have been forced to become in combat. I can only speak to who he has chosen to be now." Mrs. Sullivan did not report Eleanor to the authorities that day. Instead, she left the shop in silence, her expression troubled and uncertain. But she returned 2 days later with a request that would begin the systematic transformation of Alberta Street's relationship with its most controversial resident. Mrs. Sullivan's bakery had a small garden bed in front that had never produced anything but weeds and struggling shrubs. She asked, with obvious discomfort and carefully chosen words, whether the Japanese man who tended Eleanor's gardens might be willing to look at her beds and offer advice. She did not offer payment. She did not suggest regular visits. She simply wanted consultation from someone who clearly understood plants in ways she did not. Eleanor recognized the request as something more significant than gardening advice. Mrs. Sullivan was testing whether she could separate Kenji's knowledge from his nationality, whether she could accept help from someone she had been taught to view as irredeemably enemy. Kenji's response, when Eleanor translated the request during their next teaching session, was immediate acceptance without hesitation or conditions. The following Saturday, Kenji examined Mrs. Sullivan's garden beds while Eleanor and the bakery owner watched in silence. The consultation lasted 30 minutes. Kenji identified soil problems, explained drainage issues through his improving English, and sketched a simple design that would transform the struggling beds into something productive. Mrs. Sullivan thanked him with visible awkwardness, still unable to fully reconcile her son's death with the gentleman offering her gardening expertise. But she implemented every suggestion Kenji had made, and by November, her garden beds were showing the same transformation that Eleanor's shop had undergone. The pattern established by Mrs. Sullivan's garden began to replicate along Alberta Street with a momentum that surprised everyone involved. Mrs. Sullivan mentioned to other business owners that her gardens had been improved by consultation with someone knowledgeable, carefully avoiding mention of Kenji's nationality. But Alberta Street was a small business district where everyone knew everyone else's affairs, and the truth about Kenji's involvement could not remain hidden. The revelation created division rather than universal condemnation. Some business owners reacted with the anger Mrs. Sullivan had initially displayed, demanding that Kenji be removed from the neighborhood immediately. But others, seeing the tangible results in Eleanor's shop and Mrs. Sullivan's bakery, began to ask questions that challenged the certainty they had maintained about Japanese people. Mr. Robert Chen, who owned Chen's Grocery 2 blocks from Eleanor's shop, was the first business owner to explicitly request Kenji's help while knowing his background. Chen was Chinese American, and his family had suffered under Japanese occupation of China before immigrating to America in 1938. He had every reason to maintain hatred for Japanese people, yet he approached Eleanor with a direct request. His store had a small courtyard that he wanted to convert into a garden space where customers could sit. He had heard about Kenji's work. He understood that Kenji was Japanese, and he wanted to hire him for the project despite the complications this would create. Eleanor arranged a meeting between Chen and Kenji that Father O'Brien attended to provide both translation assistance and moral support. The conversation that followed revealed the complexity of reconciliation in ways that simple forgiveness narratives could never capture. Chen spoke directly about his family's experience under Japanese occupation, about relatives who had died during the rape of Nanking, about the hatred he had carried for Japanese people throughout the war. Kenji listened without defense or justification, then spoke carefully through Father O'Brien's translation. He acknowledged that Japanese forces had committed terrible atrocities in China, that no justification existed for the cruelty documented in places like Nanking, and that he carried shame for his nation's actions even though he had not personally participated in those specific crimes. He could not ask Chen to forgive Japanese people or to forget what had been done to his family.
He could only offer his labor and knowledge in the hope that creating something beautiful together might represent a small gesture toward a future different from the past. Chen had considered these words in silence before responding. "I cannot forgive Japan for what was done to my family, but I can work with one Japanese man to build a garden in Portland. These are not the same thing, and I will not pretend they are. If you are willing to work with someone who hates your country even while trying not to hate you personally, then we can proceed." The Courtyard Project began in December 1946 under these explicit terms of unresolved tension and deliberate coexistence. The transformation was occurring not through conversion or changed minds, but through the accumulation of small collaborations that forced individuals to hold contradictory truths simultaneously. Business owners along Alberta Street found themselves maintaining hatred for Japan as an abstraction while developing working relationships with one specific Japanese man whose knowledge and labor they needed. This cognitive dissonance created psychological pressure that gradually began to crack the certainty of categorical hatred. By January 1947, Kenji was working on projects for 6 different Alberta Street businesses, all conducted quietly without public acknowledgement. He remained technically a prisoner of war awaiting deportation, living in Sacred Heart Hospital facilities, but his daily reality had become that of a landscape consultant whose expertise was transforming an entire commercial district. The legal framework remained unchanged, the city council ban remained in effect, and public sentiment against Japanese people remained strong. Yet individual relationships were creating a parallel reality that contradicted official policy without directly challenging it. The psychological impact extended beyond the business owners who employed Kenji to their customers who encountered the results of his work. The gardens and flower displays that Kenji designed carried subtle Japanese aesthetic principles, emphasis on asymmetry, careful attention to seasonal progression, and integration of natural elements in ways that differed from conventional American landscaping. Customers who encountered these designs found them beautiful, without understanding why, without recognizing that they were appreciating Japanese artistic.
The wedding announcement that appeared in the Portland Gazette on February 14, 1951, occupied only 3 lines in the social notices section, but it represented a transformation that would have been mathematically impossible to predict 5 years earlier. Eleanor Hartwell and Kenji Nakamura were to be married at St. Michael's Cathedral on March 3rd, with Father Michael O'Brien officiating. The announcement generated immediate controversy, but the nature of that controversy revealed how completely the ground had shifted beneath Portland's certainty about Japanese exclusion. The opposition came not from city council or business leaders, but from isolated voices that found themselves increasingly marginalized as the majority of Alberta Street residents had moved toward acceptance they would never have imagined possible in 1946. Mayor Thornton, who had confidently declared Japanese exclusion necessary for Portland's protection in March 1946, issued a statement congratulating the couple and noting that Kenji had become a valued member of the Alberta Street community. The same man who had signed the business ownership ban now publicly endorsed a marriage between an American woman and a Japanese former enemy soldier. The transformation was not due to moral evolution or principled reconsideration, but to accumulated evidence that had made his previous certainty unsustainable. The irony that neither Eleanor nor Kenji fully appreciated was that the attributes Portland's leadership had identified as fatal flaws in Japanese culture had become the foundations of Kenji's success in transforming Alberta Street. His willingness to work without immediate compensation, interpreted in 1946 as evidence of unfair business practices that undercut American standards, had allowed him to demonstrate value before demanding recognition. His acceptance of hierarchical social relationships, cited as proof of inability to embrace democratic equality, had made him patient in working within systems he could not immediately change.
His maintenance of Japanese aesthetic principles, viewed as evidence of unwillingness to assimilate, had introduced design innovations that customers found beautiful without understanding their cultural origin. Every characteristic that German intelligence, that Portland City Council had dismissed as weakness, had proven to be strategic advantage in circumstances those authorities had never imagined. The concentrated effect of sustained personal interaction had achieved what direct confrontation of prejudice could never accomplish: the systematic erosion of categorical thinking through accumulated exceptions that eventually collapsed the category itself. The wedding at St. Michael's Cathedral on March 3, 1951, was attended by 73 people, a number that would have been impossible to predict in 1946. Mrs. Sullivan attended, her presence representing a journey from grief-driven hatred to grudging acceptance to genuine friendship that had taken 4 years to complete. Robert Chan attended with his family, his testimony to the complexity of maintaining historical memory while building present relationships. 15 Alberta Street business owners attended, their presence acknowledging that economic self-interest had opened doors that moral arguments could never have unlocked. The ceremony itself was brief and traditional, Father O'Brien conducting the service in English with several passages translated into Japanese by a volunteer interpreter. Kenji wore a dark suit purchased specifically for the occasion, his first formal American clothing. Eleanor wore a simple white dress with gardenias in her hair, the flowers grown by Kenji in the greenhouse he had built behind her shop. The symbolism was not subtle, but it needed no explanation for anyone who had witnessed the 5-year transformation from that first hesitant pronunciation of a flower's name to this public declaration of permanent commitment. The reception was held at Eleanor's flower shop, now officially renamed Hartwell and Nakamura Gardens, the first business on Alberta Street to bear a Japanese name since 1942. The shop had expanded to occupy 3 storefronts, its growth driven by Kenji's cultivation of specialized plants that no other Portland florist could provide. The business success represented economic validation of the partnership, demonstrating that collaboration between American and Japanese expertise could create value that neither could achieve independently. The statistical accounting of what Kenji had accomplished in 5 years provided mathematical proof of transformation that transcended individual story. He had worked on landscaping projects for 43 Alberta Street businesses. Those businesses had experienced average customer traffic increases of 31%. Property values on Alberta Street had increased 47% between 1946 and 1951, outpacing growth in comparable Portland commercial districts by significant margins. The economic impact was quantifiable, substantial, and directly attributable to Kenji's contributions. But the numbers only captured part of the transformation. The psychological shift that had occurred along Alberta Street represented something more profound than economic improvement. Business owners who had supported Japanese exclusion in 1946 now employed Japanese aesthetic principles in their storefronts. Customers who demanded deportation of enemy aliens now filled their homes with flowers cultivated using Japanese techniques. The transformation had occurred not through conversion, but through accumulated exposure that had made the previously unthinkable gradually unremarkable. The wedding represented not the climax of this transformation, but its public acknowledgement, the moment when what had been happening quietly for years could finally be stated openly without generating immediate opposition that would destroy what had been built. Mayor Thornton's attendance at the wedding reception provided the moment of complete reversal that brought the narrative full circle. He approached Kenji directly, something he would never have done in 1946, and spoke words that acknowledged how completely his understanding had shifted. 5 years ago, I believed that Japanese people could never integrate into American communities, that cultural differences were too profound and war hatred too deep. You have proven that I was measuring the wrong variables. I was focused on abstract cultural compatibility when I should have been observing concrete individual behavior.
You have contributed more to this community than many native-born citizens. I was wrong about what mattered, and I'm grateful that my error did not prevent you from remaining here to prove me wrong." The admission carried weight because Thornton was not a progressive or idealist who had opposed Japanese exclusion from principle. He was a pragmatist who had supported exclusion based on what he believed was evidence and logic, and who had changed position only when accumulated evidence made his previous position untenable. His transformation represented the broader shift that had occurred throughout Portland's leadership. The legacy of Eleanor and Kenji's story extended far beyond Alberta Strait, or even Portland. Their wedding received coverage in national newspapers as a human interest story about post-war reconciliation. The coverage focused on the romantic narrative of former enemies falling in love, but the real story was more complex and more significant. What had occurred on Alberta Street demonstrated that systematic prejudice could be undermined not through direct moral confrontation, but through accumulated practical relationships that made categorical thinking impossible to sustain. Father O'Brien wrote extensively about the Alberta Street transformation in articles for Catholic journals and secular sociology publications. His analysis focused on the mechanism of change rather than the moral lesson. He documented how economic self-interest had created initial opportunities for interaction, how sustained interaction had generated individual exceptions to categorical prejudice, and how enough exceptions had eventually collapsed the category itself. The process was not replicable through policy or program because it depended on specific circumstances. The presence of one individual whose expertise was valuable enough to overcome initial resistance, the willingness of business owners to prioritize economic benefit over ideological consistency, and the patient accumulation of small collaborations that gradually normalized what had initially seemed impossible. But while the specific circumstances were unique, the underlying principles were generalizable. Categorical prejudice was vulnerable to sustained individual interaction in ways that made personal relationship more powerful than moral argument. The flower shop that Eleanor and Kenji built together became a training ground for a generation of Portland gardeners who learned Japanese cultivation techniques without necessarily recognizing their cultural origin. The apprentices who worked at Hartwell and Nakamura Gardens carried those techniques to other businesses, other neighborhoods, and eventually other cities, spreading design and horticultural principles that entered Portland through one Japanese gardener's knowledge and patience. By 1960, Japanese design principles were evident throughout Portland's commercial landscaping, their origin forgotten by most people who encountered them, but their influence undeniable to anyone who compared Portland gardens to those in cities that had not experienced similar cultural exchange. Eleanor and Kenji's personal story became a case study taught in university sociology courses as an example of how integration could occur through economic and social interaction rather than through policy mandate or moral suasion. The case was particularly valuable because it demonstrated transformation in a community that was hostile rather than welcoming.
Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.